But here's the thing about Rian Johnson. This is the thing that a lot of people did object to about Rian Johnson, and I don't disagree with a lot of this. But one thing that a lot of people didn't like about Rian Johnson was that he approached The Last Jedi with an obvious intent to kind of mold that movie to fit a very specific political agenda. And a lot of fans didn't like that. I think it made the movie worse. I think that it diverted the plot away from places where it should have gone and took it to places where there was really no need for it to go. And so in my opinion, that was a huge mistake. Now, Rian Johnson's current place in Star Wars, what you have to understand is it is not what a lot of people imagined it was going to be. Because not only did they have Rian Johnson direct The Last Jedi, but pretty much immediately after he finished that, they actually tapped him to do a further trilogy down the road. It was going to be like a detached trilogy. The Skywalker saga is over, but they were going to have Rian Johnson do basically what it amounted to was like a second separate Star Wars saga. And even though The Last Jedi did make a ton of money, the fan response to what Rian Johnson produced was so drastic that it actually wound up torpedoing the Rian Johnson trilogy. As it happens right now, that's no longer in their plans for Star Wars. And there are a lot of people that I think are very sensitive to that. Because they had this idea that Rian Johnson was going to be the guy that was going to walk in and take over Star Wars and make it into something different, something that they wanted it to be. Something that was going to reflect their politics in particular. There was a thing that happened a couple of years ago, and this happened on Twitter, and yes, I agree, it's a very sad statement on our society. And so many things that happen on Twitter actually do wind up becoming so noteworthy. But this was an interaction between Rian Johnson and an individual by the name of Matt Jarbo. And so Rian Johnson, he came out and he posted a tweet, and it had something to do with Gamergate in some way or another. Now, that was a big internet controversy. There are two very different views on it, whether or not you were involved within what they called Gamergate or whether you were a critic of Gamergate. But Rian Johnson, he was a critic of Gamergate. And Matt Jarbo was a person who was involved in Gamergate, kind of on the Gamergater side, and he reached out to Rian Johnson and he said, well, hey, listen, if you want to know all about Gamergate, then you can talk to me about it and I'll tell you all about it from our side. And so then a third party got into this interaction, an individual by the name of Anita Sarkeesian. So Anita Sarkeesian describes herself as a media critic, but I think that in all honesty, she would be better described as an obnoxious idiot. You know, Anita Sarkeesian is what people would consider to be the main voice behind feminist frequency. But the way that I would specifically describe her is that she's one of these people that she doesn't create anything herself. But she wants to exert a lot of influence and mold things that are created so that they are created in her image of the way that she thinks that things should be. And so she got into this thing and she came in and said, it's like, oh, you're going to tell Rian freaking Johnson all about Gamergate. And it's like, well, like Rian freaking Johnson, like what does that mean? Like, do you actually think that Rian Johnson is some kind of revered figure, you know, within the Star Wars fandom? Because I can assure you that he is not. Like, if you were an actual Star Wars fan, this is not a guy that you revere. You probably revere George Lucas a lot more than that, and you definitely revere a guy like, say, Jon Favreau a lot more than you revere Rian Johnson. So what does that establish for us? Well, basically, what that really establishes for us is that Anita Sarkeesian, she is Team Rian Johnson. She wants Rian Johnson to be the guy who's going to guide the Star Wars franchise to wherever it's going to go. And one thing that becomes obvious as you kind of continue to look at the things that she's had to say about Star Wars is that she does not want Jon Favreau to be the guy that guides Star Wars to its destination. In particular, there was a recent tweet that Anita Sarkeesian posted where she complained about The Mandalorian in particular. Now, she's complained about it an awful lot, from things like saying that the first episode had no speaking female characters, although the episodes since then have had many, many, many characters, a very diverse cast of female characters in the months since. So that's not really a valid complaint, and I think her most recent one actually had to do with something so simple as the female Mandalorian characters that he encounters during Season 2. I'm not going to get into the details. I'm not going to drop any spoilers here. Don't worry. But one thing that she took objection to is that these particular characters, they had, they were women and they had boob imprints on their armor. And so she got upset about that, said that, oh, it's accentuating their female form and sexualizing them and objectifying them, blah, 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 blah. And even when all sorts of women came forward and said, things like, well, for example, I was in the Marines, and the tack vests that they give us are not designed for women, and they're very painful to wear, because we have breasts. She didn't want to hear from any of them. Because really, for her, it wasn't about making a valid criticism. It was just about getting back at Jon Favreau for being the guy whose vision of Star Wars is succeeding compared to the guy that she wanted to be charting the course for Star Wars, whose vision failed. So in recent years, particularly in recent months, there's been kind of this theory that's emerged among Star Wars fans. And it's this idea that there are two competing camps within Lucasfilm. So there is one camp that's represented by individuals such as Jon Favreau, and their whole thing is that they want to try to stay true to what George Lucas had created and respect his view of the Star Wars universe and create more things like what George Lucas was creating. And then on the other hand, it's believed that there's another camp, an opposing camp, that's led by people like Rian Johnson. He's considered to represent it in a lot of ways. But it's also considered to be led by Kathleen Kennedy. And their whole vision is that they want to transform Star Wars. And of course, a lot of them will say the same things about, well, we want to make it more inclusive. We want to make it more welcoming to more people. We want to bring in more Star Wars fans, even if that means that we chase away some of the old ones. Which, quite frankly, is always, that's a terrible business model. To chase away the audience that you have in hopes that you're going to attract a different one that you like better. That very rarely happens. And as a matter of fact, within the Disney banner, at Marvel Comics, they could tell you all about how that has failed. They could tell you all about the times that they have tried to do that in recent memory and that they failed. So let's take that back to what I was talking about earlier. And let's talk about that thing that I was telling you about, where people who had very little to do with, very little or nothing to do with building something into what it is, coming along and taking it for themselves and basically saying, this is something that we control now. Like, this is something that we control now. We're going to use this for our agenda. We're going to use this to advance our careers. And in my opinion, I think that's exactly what people like Johnson, people like Kennedy, people like Sarkeesian are trying to do with Star Wars. And that's why so much of what you have seen come out regarding Star Wars in recent years just hasn't worked. And I think that that's why they're so threatened when somebody comes out, somebody that actually a lot of people didn't even want to be directing a Star Wars thing. There were people who actually had come out and said that Jon Favreau shouldn't have been hired to direct The Mandalorian because he was a white male, and because Star Wars has allegedly had too many white male directors. And that's the guy whose vision of Star Wars is currently succeeding. And the interesting thing is that because Star Wars is somewhat reliable at the theater box office, you don't really see this with a lot of their box office numbers. I mean, Solo is a little bit of an anomaly, because that whole thing there was an actual organized effort to torque that one, and unfortunately, I thought that was really dumb, because that has actually cost Star Wars fans additional Star Wars movies, the amount of money that was lost on Solo. So Solo is a case where Star Wars failed, but Solo is also an anomaly. Other than that, Star Wars has been very reliable at the box office. So I know a lot of people would probably look at the box office numbers and say, well, where do you really get the sense that these other people have failed and that Jon Favreau has succeeded? And actually, as it turns out, where you see that manifest is in the merchandise sales. Something that, if you're a Star Wars fan, you understand this. Non-Star Wars fans, I don't think really understand this. But the biggest value of Star Wars has actually not really been its box office numbers. The biggest value of Star Wars has been the merchandising. That's actually where George Lucas made so much of his money, and that's why it was such an absolute coup. When he did the distribution deal for Star Wars all the way back in the 70s, like all the way at the end of the 70s and through the 80s, one thing that he always made sure that he always made sure that he had the merchandising rights. So not only did George Lucas make a lot of money off of the movie, but the toy lines, the clothing lines, all of the merchandise, the lunch boxes. So much of that money went directly into George Lucas's pockets. George Lucas isn't a billionaire because of isn't a billionaire because he did his deal with Disney. He's not a billionaire because of what his movies did at the box office. He's a billionaire off of the merchandise that was sold. So this is where you actually see these things manifest when it comes to Star Wars. So if you don't see the rejection of a lot of Star Wars fans in the box office numbers, you do see it in the sheer number of unsold action figures. And if you have any trouble believing that the Star Wars action figures, that a lot of them just stopped selling, go take a stroll to your neighborhood Dollarama. Wherever the closest one is, go there. The odds are that you are probably going to find some Star Wars action figures in there, and most of them are going to be characters from this third trilogy. There's a very common saying in marketing and business: you've got to give the people what they want. And unfortunately for Lucasfilm right now, what you have there is you have a few people in power that literally came to it and said, we're not going to give the people what they want. We're not going to give them what they want because there are too many straight white males there, and we don't want to create things for them. We want to create things for other people. And in any case, they don't really matter because it's not really about them anymore. Now it's about us. We're in control of this thing. We are the ascendant, and we decide what they get. If they're going to be Star Wars fans, they have to consume what we produce for them. And a lot of Star Wars fans have actually just kind of said to you, it's like, well, okay, like, screw you. Like, see ya. Basically, you're talking about people who got control of the thing that they didn't create, but now that they have control of it, they're going to run it in their own interests, for their own agenda, and everybody else can basically get stuffed. I mean, in many ways, yes, that is very different than a Disney executive, who may very well care whether or not their former employees can afford to eat, but apparently aren't troubled enough about whether or not they can't to refuse a $12 million bonus. Perhaps not in the same way, but you're talking about another person who has managed to get control of something that they didn't create, and now they're going to use it for their own ends. Whether their ends are the advancement of a political or social agenda, or whether or not it's just filling their own bank account. That's exactly what they're doing. Disney isn't the only place where I see this kind of thing happening, and Disney isn't even the place where it bothers me the most. One thing that I have tended to notice is that the more people I hear talking about how we have to rebuild and reset the economy because it doesn't work for such and such. All these people who think that they know enough about the economy to reset and rebuild the thing and change it and make it work to their ends are quite often people who had the least to do with making it what it actually is now. If I were to do a podcast about the number of instances I can think of where people who didn't create something get control of it, or at the very least demand control of something that they didn't create and they had nothing to do with and they don't know anything about, I don't think that podcast would end anytime soon, unfortunately. Now, as it relates to Star Wars, I think that the results of that very much do speak for themselves. And I am going to say one more thing about it before I leave off for the week, and that is that if you're not watching The Mandalorian, I couldn't imagine how you're not. Like, if you consider yourselves to be a Star Wars fan and you're not watching The Mandalorian, that's incomprehensible to me. But even if you've only ever watched Star Wars in passing and you just love great television, and in all honesty, like, who doesn't love a little bit of great television? Well, then The Mandalorian is a fantastic place to park some of your hours to check this out, because it is a fantastic, just extremely amazing and very accessible viewing experience. I can't recommend it highly enough.